On the 30th of July 1997, there was the Thredbo Landslide.
On the 30th of July 1997, a landslide above the small Australian ski resort of Thredbo in New South Wales sent a huge quantity of mud, rock and water hurtling towards the buildings below.
That's the first interesting thing, because who knew there was proper ski resorts in Australia? As an outsider, now obviously I know that now, but when I first started exploring Australia, no way would I have thought there was a ski resort, because the perception is it's hot all year round. But no, apparently there is a mountain in Australia that gets more snowfall than the Swiss Alps. Something like that. One of those. Don't hold me 100% to that.
The resulting disaster would necessitate a 9-day rescue attempt and lead to one of the longest and most complex landslide investigations ever seen. The village of Thredbo is located in the Snowy Mountains, Australia's highest mountain range, around 300 miles or 500 kilometres south of Sydney. It is in the valley of the Thredbo River, with the name coming from the Aboriginal inhabitants of the area. European settlement of Thredbo dates back to the 19th century, when it was a popular base for prospectors during the Thredbo Rush, a period where it was thought that the river contained large quantities of gold. It didn't, but several frustrated gold diggers took up skiing whilst in the area, leading to the establishment of the very first ski club in the area in the 1860s.
Wow.
Thredbo remained a quiet village for the first half of the 20th century, with a moderate amount of tourism. This all changed when work began on a hydroelectric scheme in 1949. The scheme brought in a huge influx of workers, many of whom were Europeans with plenty of experience of skiing. One Czech worker named Tony Sponar had been a ski instructor in Austria, but had moved to Australia to work on the hydroelectric project.
Isn't it amazing? So this Thredbo was a tiny little village almost, but it's incredible how when all of a sudden there is a big job on, a big infrastructure that needs to be built, it can just multiply a village into a town, into a city, because, when people come to work in a certain location, you need the infrastructure, you need the housing. And so that seems the case on this, that there was not a lot there until they thought, okay, well, this is a great place to have a electro high. I can't remember what he said. Hang on.
But had moved to Australia to work on the hydroelectric project.
The hydroelectric project.
When he saw plans for the construction of Alpine Way, a new road that would provide much better access to the area, he saw the potential for increased tourism. He set up the Kosciuszko Chairlift and Thredbo Hotel Syndicate, tasked with establishing Thredbo as a major ski resort. By 1957, commercial ski tourism began in the village. The resort was modelled on European skiing towns to reflect the heritage of the workers, with ski lodges, a ski school, and plenty of chairlifts. It grew rapidly in popularity and was even a popular destination for American soldiers when they were given leave from fighting in the Vietnam War. By the 1990s, Thredbo had become the only alpine resort in Australia to operate all year round, incorporating the largest snowmaking system in the Southern Hemisphere. The village continued to grow and...
Sorry, I was going to say, it's saying that it had its own snow, it made its own snow, and I was thinking... Before that, I was thinking, well, how could they go all year round? Surely there's not snow there all year round. But no, they have their own way of making snow. That's interesting.
Receive more and more investment. It was, for many years, a brilliant success story and a beloved escape for many holidaymakers. At around 11:30 a.m. on the evening of the 30th of July, 1997...
That's meant to be PM. Not AM.
Earth began to slide down the mountain. Around 3.8 million kilograms, or 3,800 tons, of rock, water, and liquefied earth were incorporated into the slide,
That's a lot.
Which ran down the mountainside until it crashed into the Carinya Lodge. The force of the impact tore the building in two. The landslide continued, joined by the debris of the Karinya. It crossed a small lake before colliding with the Bimbadeen Ski Lodge at high speed and continuing down to the Bimbadeen Staff Lodge. All 3 buildings were completely destroyed. The New South Wales Fire Brigade Communication Centre started receiving calls within 10 minutes of the landslide, but most callers weren't fully able to understand what had happened. Some reported a small explosion, while others stated that up to 100 people were trapped in wreckage. By 12:30 am, police had arrived at the scene and ordered an evacuation of the area.
The thing is, when you have buildings on a hill, on a mountain, on a slope, if the first one goes, then it's just adding momentum. It's adding weight that's going to keep piling down, isn't it? So when it gets to the second one, the second building has no chance, then the third one has no chance, and it's just taking everything with it.
A regional disaster was declared and medical staff were sent from nearby regions to help. They joined many volunteers from other organisations such as the Australian Red Cross and the Volunteer Rescue Association. The problem for the emergency services was that the area was too unstable for them to get close to the demolished buildings. At 7:30 am on the morning after the landslide, the 31st of July, a medical command post was set up in a lodge close to the disaster site, and by 10 am a team of geophysicists arrived from Sydney. After assessing the site, they gave the go-ahead for an excavation of the top layer of the rubble. Even with this expert analysis, digging in the rubble remained a risky prospect. The site was still unstable, and more than 6,120 litres, or 16,000 gallons, of icy water were rushing through the debris every hour.
Cool.
The rescuers themselves were at risk. Many of them had to be treated for minor injuries, and the medical team prepared to treat exhaustion and hypothermia. At 4:20 p.m. on the 31st of July, the first body was found.
Ooh.
It would take over 4 hours before it could be pulled out. Such was the precarious nature of the rubble.
The difference with this one and, for example, the Granville rail disaster is, at least with the rail disaster, the workers can get there and they can do their best to move everything out of the way and get the rubble out and try and get to people. But what I'm seeing from this is that because the ground was so unstable, it was so difficult to actually find people and move rubble because you're putting your own life in risk. So there's a big difference there with trying to rescue people, and it's like, I don't know if this analogy works, but I'm going to say it anyway because I say things that come off the top of my head anyway. But it's like when you're on an aeroplane and they say, well, make sure you put your oxygen mask on before you put your child's on. And if I can relate to this, it's almost, well, you got to have yourself protected before you can help anyone else. And it seemed like it was very difficult to be safe whilst clearing out and trying to find people. I don't know if that analogy works. Let me know in the comments. And while you're there, make sure you like the video and subscribe.
The search continued through the night. 250 workers were permitted to work at a time, with shifts lasting 2 hours before 4 hours of rest. While they searched, efforts were made to reinforce the area in the hope of preventing further landslides. The conditions were perilous. The ground was sloped and unstable, while the temperature dropped to -14 degrees Celsius or 6.8 degrees Fahrenheit
Cold.
during the night. Early in the morning of the 1st of August, another body was found, with 2 more being discovered later in the day. These bodies couldn't be recovered initially, as the rocks in the area were too unstable. A large slab of concrete, which had been part of the Bimbadeen car park, had formed a barrier, preventing rescue workers from accessing the area. Throughout the day, doctors met with relatives of the missing, and Assistant Police Commissioner Ken Moroney gave a statement to reporters about the hope of discovering any survivors, saying, "I think at this stage the chances are quite remote." At this point, thermal imaging and fibre optic cameras were showing no signs of life. At 5:37 a.m. the next morning, workers dropped sound equipment down a hole that they had just finished digging, and were astounded to pick up sounds of movement from underneath a concrete slab. Firefighter Steve Hurst shouted, "Rescue team working overhead. Can anyone hear me?" A man's voice replied, "I can hear you." The rescue team asked whether he had sustained any injuries, to which the trapped man replied, "No, but my feet are bloody cold."
That's I suppose the issue, isn't it? It's once again I link this to the other disasters, and the Granville one, for example. At least they weren't stuck in freezing cold temperatures. Now, with how long it would take to find people and rescue people in this situation, and how cold it is, it's like a ticking time bomb almost, isn't it? On how long you have to save people before they get hypothermia and whatnot.
The man was Stuart Diver, a 27-year-old ski instructor. Trapped below 3 concrete slabs, he was 2 meters or 2.2 yards below the surface. He had been in his bedroom with his wife Sally when the landslide hit, and had been swept away by the icy floodwater. While he had been able to get his head above the water, Sally had been pinned down by a concrete slab and had drowned. Stuart had spent more than 2 days trapped in freezing water next to the body of his wife.
That's just unimaginable. And the way then he had said, this really sounds weird. The way that when the rescue team asked if you're okay, and he said no, but my feet are bloody cold. That seems a strange response, considering your wife is not alive next year. Oh man, that's not nice.
Finding Stuart had given the rescue team a huge morale boost, but releasing him was a complicated task. They couldn't risk digging directly towards him, as they ran the risk of slabs slipping down and crushing him, so they began to dig a tunnel from the side of the slope. They were able to get fluids to him and pipe in some warmer air to increase his body temperature. A paramedic, Paul Featherstone, stayed talking to him throughout the rescue attempt. Any slight movement in the rubble required the area to be evacuated until it was deemed safe. But Featherstone stayed with Stuart even when movement was detected and continued talking to him to keep him calm throughout. After 11 hours of digging at 5:10 p.m. on the 2nd of August, Stuart was finally freed. In total, he had been trapped for 65 hours. He was rushed to hospital, where he was treated for frostbite, a relatively minor injury given the scale of the disaster. The search for more survivors continued for 5 more days, but no more were found. The final and 18th body was pulled from the rubble on the 7th of August, 9 days after the initial landslide.
Do you know what? I feel so sad for him. This may sound crude, so please don't take it like that. But, for the people that have passed away, they've passed away and they don't know anything else. Their life is gone. It's the people that are left behind. So in this case, this gentleman that was with his wife while she was there for a couple of days, passed away next to him. I don't feel sorry for the people that died because they said they died. I feel so sorry for that man that had to go through that. That's really hit me, because I'm just, imagine Charlie and if I was in that situation and
Landslides are most commonly natural disasters. But when the coroner's report into the Thredbo landslide was released in 2000, it highlighted several man-made factors. While the heavy rain and melting snow was the main cause of the slide, there was also a leaking water main near Alpine Way. This had gradually saturated the land below the road until it became weak enough to collapse. The land itself was vulnerable due to historic landslides, some centuries ago, which had led to the ground being loose underneath the surface. The land had been moving very slowly for decades, and it was this movement that had weakened and eventually broken the water main. The land was unstable and had never been suitable for the amount of development it saw. The report also noted that there had been previous landslides before 1997 that should have warranted action from the relevant authorities. Alpine Way had originally been intended to give temporary access for the construction of the hydroelectric plant back in the 1950s. It was never built to last as long as it did, nor to have the amount of use that it did. Responsibility for the maintenance of the road transferred from the Snowy Mountains Hydroelectric Authority to the National Parks and Wildlife Service, who did not have the budget to maintain roads. In the aftermath of the disaster, terraces were constructed on the slopes to reinforce the land, and Alpine Way was rebuilt with retaining walls. The area is now monitored with inclinometers to detect any movement in the slope. Following intervention from the Supreme Court of Australia, the Government of New South Wales paid out $40 million in out-of-court settlements with businesses and individuals following the incident, a process that took 7 years. The Search and Rescue Division of the Fire Brigade was expanded, and responsibility for Alpine Way was diverted to the Roads and Traffic Authority. Lessons were learned from the Thredbo landslide, but at an extremely high cost.
Wow. In a scale of things, there was 18 lives lost. And so in this grand scale of things compared to other disasters, it's not necessarily the worst. But there's fatal errors that weren't fixed, man-made problems that weren't fixed. And just to hear that story, it's really, really hit me. That is just horrible. But once again, you've got to hope that they really have learned from the mistakes that were made. And by the sounds of it, they have. The precautions have been made. The fixes have been made. Wow, that was a rough one. That was a real tough one to listen to and watch. There's another disaster, and that was the toughest. Thank you so much for watching. Make sure you like and subscribe, and I'll catch you next time.